What does reading a novel, playing a piece of music, and solving an algebra problem all have in common? All of these three activities are complex in nature and require a complete knowledge about simpler parts before the larger task can be understood. These tasks can be considered cumulative in nature because we have to understand the simpler building blocks of the activity before we can tackle the more complicated problem in front of us. Let's take reading a novel as an example before we explore how this corresponds to music. If we wanted to read and understand a novel, we would need to be able to read and comprehend chapters, paragraphs, sentences, words, and letters. We wouldn't expect to be able to read paragraphs before we could read words because words make up the building blocks of paragraphs. Let's explore how this idea of building blocks can be used to help effectively practice a new piece of music. Feeling overwhelmed is a common reaction to receiving a new piece of music from students at all levels because our eyes are scanning the big picture, which always appears more frightening. When we focus on the big picture of playing a piece by looking at the whole piece, the music seems more overwhelming, frustrating, and unapproachable. To overcome these initial feelings, we need to use the same logic we use for reading. We don't read the whole book at once. Instead, we read words which make up sentences, paragraphs, and chapters. In the same way, thinking of these building blocks to learn music makes it more approachable. The truth is, our brains much prefer smaller, bite-sized bits of information, and if we work with what our brain naturally reacts to, we can see much faster progress. Let's look at how this theory would go into practice by looking at a well-known beginner song, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Although this song may be simple, the process we will discuss to learn it effectively can be used for pieces of any difficulty level. The smallest building block we will look at for this song is the measure. This song has 12 measures, which each need to be understood before we can move on to larger sections. To start my practice, I will practice each measure until I can get them right 3 to 5 times in a row. If I make a mistake in a measure, I will practice it until I can get it right. Next, I will extend the sections to 2-measure sections and repeat the process of practicing this larger building block until I can get it right. Next, I will extend the sections to 4 measures and then try the whole piece. Repetition at each level of the building blocks is very important. Repeating smaller sections enhances 3 different sensory forms of memory. Repetition firstly improves visual memory. By improving visual memory, students can remember what the notes look like on the sheet of music without it being in front of them. They also memorize their starting hand position and what their hands will look like on the keys as they play. Auditory memory refers to a student having a solid memory of how the piece should sound. Auditory memory acts as a guide to let the student know if they are playing the piece correctly or if they need to correct a mistake. Finally, repetition builds a solid muscle memory, where the fingers become trained to hit the right notes and move fluidly from section to section. Since repetition is so important, it is a good idea to track your repetitions of each building block, whether it is 1-measure, 2-measure, or 4-measure sections. A couple of fun ways to track this involves using an abacus or a poppet. However, you can also just use tallies or check marks on a piece of paper. Let's go over a few tips to help you start your own building block practice routine. First of all, consider the difficulty of the piece for you. The harder a piece of music is for you, the smaller of building blocks you should start with to learn the piece. If a piece is easier for you, you may be able to start working in 4-measure sections. When first learning a piece, this is about as large of a section as you should tackle at a time, even if the music is easy. If a piece is moderately difficult, try working in 2-measure sections to begin. Finally, if a piece is very difficult, consider working just 1 measure at a time. You can break any of these sections down further by playing hands separately, just the left hand part and then just the right hand part before putting them together. This tactic is a good idea for building blocks of all sizes if the section is tricky and to establish a solid muscle memory. After you have a solid understanding of the small building blocks that make up your piece, we need to start linking sections together. If we think of learning our piece like a builder, once we have the building blocks in place, we need to use the mortar to join the blocks together. Let's talk about 2 ways we can do this. The first way we can practice joining sections together is called across the bar line practice. In this form of practice, we go a little bit farther than our section into the next section. This helps us practice the transition from one section to the next. In this example, shown by the arrow, I am practicing linking these 2-measure sections together by practicing the first 2 measures of the first section and going into the first measure of the second section. A second way we can practice joining sections together is called radial practice. This type of practice focuses on the transition itself. When starting out in radial practice, we may practice 1 measure before and after the change takes place, as shown by the first arrow. When this transition is comfortable, we can try linking the 2 sections together fully. Let's look at one last thing today about building block practice. Even after going through all of these steps, we may find when we run the whole piece that there are some mistakes in our performance. When we notice mistakes, it's important not to ignore them, but instead focus on making these difficult parts better. Do not just repeat the whole piece when a mistake is made, but focus on the parts that are difficult to make them better. Remember that when a larger section is hard, you can always break it down into smaller building blocks. And one of the best ways to do this in a passage that we are making constant mistakes is by hand-separate practice. With all of these tips, you now know the basic ideas behind building block practice and how you can use it to practice more effectively. Let's review what we have learned. Music practice is cumulative, meaning that we need to understand and learn the small parts of a piece of music before we can understand the piece as a whole. The way that we understand small parts of music is by using a practice technique called building blocks, where we practice small sections that are 1, 2, or 4 measures long at a time. Correct repetition of small sections is important in fully understanding a piece of music and in improving visual, auditory, and muscle memory. The size of our building block can vary depending on how hard the piece is for us, ranging from about 4 measures at a time for an easy piece to 1 measure at a time for a difficult piece. Once we have our building blocks solid, we can expand our sections by linking them together. The 2 ways we learned of linking sections together are by across the bar line practice and radial practice. Finally, when you notice you are making mistakes or you're in a difficult section of the music, make it easier by breaking it down into smaller building blocks before playing the whole piece through again. And with these concepts, you should be able to effectively use building block practice.